Welcome back, everybody, to the deep dive. Today we're looking at a question that always comes up when we talk about cities and trying to help struggling communities, and that is, can we actually make a difference by just spending a lot of money?
Right.
And we're going to be looking at Baltimore specifically
Okay.
and their Empowerment Zones initiative from the 90s. So this is a program where the federal government spent millions of dollars
Wow.
in certain areas trying to revitalize them.
Yep.
And we're going to be looking at an article that came out in 2001 from the Daily Record.
Okay.
And it's titled, Are the Zones Empowering?
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's kind of a loaded question, right?
Right.
And so we're going to be talking about some of the things that went right, some of the things that maybe didn't work out so well, and kind of the lasting impact of the program.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because on the surface, it looks like one of those classic government programs
Uh-huh.
that, that they try to do something good, but does it really work? So you've got job creation, workforce development, all that stuff. But did it really work?
Yeah.
That's what we're trying to figure out today.
Yeah, and it's interesting, too, because you get these kind of competing narratives.
Yeah.
On one hand, you've got people like Joey Richards. She owns Charm City Signs.
Okay.
And she says that the program is the only reason why she was able to start her business and get it going.
Okay.
And what's really interesting is that she got a loans through the program.
Right.
But then Empower Baltimore Management Corporation, which I'm going to shorten that to EBMC.
Got it.
They actually became her first customer. So they were really putting their money where their mouth was.
That's pretty cool. Yeah, they were really invested in it.
Exactly, yeah. But then, the article also says that you can drive through these zones and you still see vacant houses and abandoned buildings.
Oh, wow. So it didn't totally work.
Right, so that's the question, right?
Yeah.
So was it a success or a failure?
Yeah, that's a tough one.
And it's interesting because EBMC, which was the organization in charge of the money, they actually did meet a lot of their goals, especially when it came to creating jobs and workforce development.
So they were successful.
It sounds like, but then, what about these vacant houses? Like, was that just something they just didn't even think about?
Well, it's not that easy. I mean, they did get criticized for not addressing that specific problem.
Okay.
And in the article, Diane Bell, she was the president of EBMC, she said that she regretted not doing more about it.
Oh.
But I mean, they had limited resources and they had to make tough choices. So they focused on what they thought was the most important thing, which was jobs.
So they were thinking, if we can get people jobs and an income, then they'll be able to deal with the housing issue down the road.
Right. It's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, know?
Yeah.
You got to take care of the basics first.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And it wasn't just about like, okay, here's a job.
Yeah.
It was about giving people the skills they needed to keep those jobs.
Exactly.
To build a career. So they were putting a lot of money into job training. They set up career centers, and they were even helping people with things like substance abuse and childcare.
Wow, that's really going above and beyond.
Right, because those are things that can keep people from being able to work.
Absolutely.
So they were really trying to look at the whole picture.
Yeah.
So I guess the question is, did it work? Like, did they get actual results?
Well, the numbers are pretty impressive. I mean, they beat their goals for creating jobs, and they trained and placed over 6,800 people in jobs.
Wow.
Yeah, they were shooting for 5,000, so they did a lot better than they thought they would.
That's great. But were they just putting people in any job, or were they trying to, like, match people's skills with the jobs that were actually available?
Yeah, that's a good question, and the article actually talks about that.
Okay.
Apparently, sometimes it was harder to find qualified workers than it was to find the jobs.
Oh, so even though they were training all these people,
Right.
the training didn't necessarily match up with what the businesses were looking for.
Yeah, it seems like maybe they missed the mark on that one.
Yeah, that seems like a big problem.
It is, and it makes you think about how sustainable these programs really are. You can train people all you want, but if the skills they're learning aren't useful, then what's the point?
Right. Yeah, because those jobs might not be there in a few years.
Exactly.
So even if they were successful at first, it doesn't mean it's going to last.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
And it makes you think about how we define success in these programs. Is it just about meeting the initial goals, or is it about creating something that can last?
That's a really good point, because it's not just about giving people a temporary boost. It's about giving them the tools to succeed in the long run.
Right. It's about making a real difference in their lives.
But it's not easy. And it's definitely more complicated than just spending money.
Way more complicated.
Yeah, and I think what we're seeing with Baltimore's empowerment zones is a great example of that. It's not a simple success or failure.
Yeah.
There's a lot of nuance there. So we've seen that they did a lot of good in terms of jobs and workforce development.
Right.
But then there's this whole other issue of the vacant houses and whether the changes they made will last.
It's complicated.
It is. So I think there's still a lot more to talk about with Baltimore's empowerment zones.
It's interesting, you mentioned that disconnect between like what people were being trained for and the jobs that were actually out there.
Yeah.
It happens all the time with these programs.
It makes sense, though, right? Like the jobs are always changing, and it's hard to keep up,
It is.
especially in industries that are changing really fast. But did the empowerment zones try to do anything about that? Like, was there any way for them to kind of check in and see if things were still working?
So that's where the village centers come in.
Okay.
They weren't just about providing services. It was
Okay.
supposed to be a place where the community could come together and like work on economic development. So residents, businesses, government agencies all in one place.
So it's kind of like a mini version of the whole empowerment zone thing, but just focused on a specific neighborhood?
Yeah, exactly. They had job training, business support, and it was a place where people could talk to each other and give feedback.
Okay.
So they could help make sure that what people were learning was actually what businesses needed.
Oh, okay. So the village centers were kind of like a bridge between the training programs and the employers.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
And because they were right there in the community,
Right.
they could see what was going on and adjust things as needed.
Yeah, that's smart.
And the article talks about a really good example of this,
Oh.
Historic East Baltimore Community Action Coalition.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
Yeah, I know, right?
So what did they do?
Well, they had this program called Main Street,
Okay.
and they focused on making the neighborhood look better, renovating buildings, supporting businesses.
Oh, so they were trying to make it a place where people would want to live and work.
Exactly. They wanted to create a sense of place,
Right.
attract new businesses, revitalize the whole area.
It's interesting that they focused on like the visual stuff too. Like making the buildings look nice.
Yeah,
Because it's one thing to have jobs, but if the place looks run down, nobody's going to want to be there.
that's true. And it's not just about looks either. It's about making people feel proud of where they live,
Yeah.
giving them a sense of ownership.
Right. It's not just some outside group coming in and saying, we're going to fix this.
Yep.
It's about getting the community involved.
Exactly.
That's really cool. And it kind of goes back to what we were saying before about how success isn't just about numbers.
Right.
It's about those harder to measure things like community pride and how connected people feel to their neighborhood.
Yeah, it's about building something that lasts.
Mhm.
And that brings us to a really important point.
Go.
What happens when the money runs out?
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. The empowerment zones were only supposed to last until 2005.
Right.
So what happens to all these great programs after that?
Well, the article says that EBMC was trying to find other ways to fund the village centers and the loan programs. They were looking for partners like maybe Johns Hopkins University.
So they were thinking ahead.
They were trying to.
But it's hard, right? Like, even if they found some money, it's not going to be as much as the federal government was giving them.
No, it won't be.
So were these programs really built to last, or were they always going to need help?
It's a tough question. I don't know if they really had an answer for that.
It's like they built this amazing house, but it's on a shaky foundation.
Yeah.
Like, eventually it's going to fall apart. So how do you build something that can really stand the test of time?
Well, I think the empowerment zones teach us that we need to focus on building up the community itself.
Okay.
Not just giving them money, but giving them the tools and the skills to take charge.
So instead of making them dependent on outside help,
Right.
you're making them self-sufficient.
Exactly. But that's a long process.
Yeah. It's not going to happen overnight.
No, but it's the only way to create real change that lasts.
Yeah. And it takes a different way of thinking about community development.
It does.
It's not about quick fixes. It's about long-term vision.
Absolutely.
It's about building relationships and trusting the community to know what's best for them.
It is. And success isn't just about money. It's about how strong and resilient the community is.
That's a good point. So when we look back at the empowerment zones, how do we judge them? Were they just a temporary Band-Aid, or did they leave behind something that could really make a difference?
I think that's what we need to keep exploring.
Yeah.
We need to look at the results and what we can learn from them, both the good and the bad.
Okay.
But first, I think we need to talk about one of the biggest criticisms of the program, which is that they didn't do anything about the vacant houses.
Yeah, that's a big one. And it gets to the heart of the problem.
Yeah.
Like, what do you prioritize when you have limited resources?
Right. What are the tough choices you have to make?
I'm really curious to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah.
We've been talking a lot about Baltimore's empowerment zones, and it just seems like a lot of other programs that try to help cities.
Yeah.
They make these big promises.
Right.
And sometimes things get better, but then you wonder if those changes are going to last.
Right.
And when we talk about the vacant houses in Baltimore, it really makes you think about that whole idea of lasting change.
It does. It's like a classic problem in community development. You
Mm.
don't have enough money to do everything,
Right.
so you have to choose what to focus on.
And in Baltimore, they chose jobs and workforce development.
Yeah, they figured if they could get people working and earning a good living,
Uh-huh.
then they could take care of things like housing later on.
Yeah, but is that how it really works?
That's the question, isn't it?
Like, can you really just ignore a problem like vacant houses
Yeah.
and expect it to fix itself?
It's not that simple.
Yeah.
And the article says that a lot of people criticized EBMC for not doing more about the vacant houses.
Okay.
Even Diane Bell, the president of EBMC, said she wished they had done more.
But they were trying to create this ripple effect, right?
Yeah.
They thought if they improve the economy, then eventually people would have the money and the resources to fix up the houses.
Right. It was a long-term plan.
But did it work?
It's hard to say. The article doesn't really tell us what happened with the housing situation.
Oh, really?
It focuses mostly on the jobs and the training programs.
Okay.
And those are important,
Right.
but they don't tell the whole story.
So we don't know if people were actually able to buy homes or if the neighborhood started to look better.
We don't know for sure.
That seems like a pretty big missing piece.
It is. It shows us that when we're trying to figure out if a program worked,
Yeah.
we can't just look at a few numbers.
Yeah.
We have to look at the big picture.
Did people's lives actually get better?
Right. Did the community become stronger?
Did they make it a place where people actually wanted to live?
Exactly.
And I guess in the case of Baltimore's empowerment zones, we don't really have a clear answer.
That's true, but maybe that's the lesson here.
What do you mean?
I mean, fixing up a city is complicated.
It's not like there's one easy solution.
No, it's a messy process.
Yeah. And sometimes, even when you try to do the right thing,
Mm-hmm.
things don't work out the way you planned.
That's life, right?
Yeah. And I think Baltimore's empowerment zones are a perfect example of that. They did some good things,
They did.
but there were also some missed opportunities.
Absolutely.
And maybe the most important thing is that we learn from their experience.
I agree. We need to figure out what worked, what didn't work,
Yeah.
and how we can do better in the future.
Because just throwing money at a problem doesn't always solve it.
No, it doesn't.
You need to plan, you need community involvement, and you need to be willing to adapt as you go.
And you need to think about the long term.
Right. Not just what's going to happen next year, but what's going to happen 10 years from now, 20 years from now.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Baltimore's empowerment zones, I think we're left with a lot to think about.
We are.
It's a story of hope and frustration, of successes and failures. And I think it shows us that there's no easy answer when it comes to revitalizing cities.
It's a challenge, but it's a challenge worth taking on.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Baltimore's empowerment zones. We hope you learned something new, and we hope you'll keep exploring these important issues.
And keep asking those tough questions.
Exactly. See you next time.